This is the second of two videos about Vicksburg. I want to take you through the thoughts of a few scholars who have studied the logistical aspects of Grant's movement and the siege itself. So our first expert here is Warren Grabeau. He's a geographer who has thought about what it takes to embark upon and successfully pull off a campaign like the Vicksburg campaign. Grabeau argues that the Civil War was won and lost via logistics. He thinks of the pre-July 1863 era as being won by Confederate logistics in the East, and thinks of July 1863 and after as largely being won by Union logistical successes in the West. Vicksburg is where he says this occurs, this begins. Because of the size of Civil War armies, Grabeau notes, tactics are only a part of victory, right? One can have all of the tactical genius available, but the logistics of feeding, keeping, supplying an army are the thing that eventually start to wear down both numbers and like physical possibilities. And so Grabeau points to Grant as the epitome of logistical genius, and he thinks that the Vicksburg campaign shows this. Grabeau, knows that Grant needed to move quickly, both to the west of the river, but also after crossing the river, moving quickly to take Jackson and move back on Vicksburg. That the quickness, the speed, meant that the chances of foraging were difficult, right? The army had to live off the land, as Mark Grimsley would show us, and living off the land at the same time moving quickly, right? So not camping, but moving swiftly to bring about a military solution to the problem of Vicksburg. Grabeau uses water as his main example of Grant's logistics. He thinks that it gives us a way to visualize the effort needed. In western Mississippi, rainwater is the main source of drinkable water, and most residents are using it by capturing it in cisterns, right up on their roof perhaps. And in the Vicksburg area, there aren't natural sources of water that are going to be able to keep an army alive once that army has left the Mississippi River. And so this area right here is the area that Grabeau is focusing on, right? After the army has crossed the river and is moving on Jackson and etc., how it's keeping alive via water. He gives a few statistical estimates to start to add up the cost here. So at a minimum, an individual should drink about a gallon of water a day, both for drinking but also for cooking food. The Army of the Tennessee at this time has about 42,000 men at the beginning of the campaign. So roughly then 42,000 gallons of water a day at an absolute minimum. Horses in the Army require 4 gallons a day at minimum, and there are just under 10,000 horses in the Army of the Tennessee, and so something like 39,000 gallons of water a day for horses. Adding the water for the troops to the water for horses produces Grabeau's statistic of 81,000 gallons of water a day. So in other words, the Army has to deliver 81,000 gallons of water a day. They do this through 350 wagons hauling water every single day. These wagons are almost, in 24-hour operation. By the time of the end of the siege in early July, there's 77,000 men to Grant's army. And so Grabeau wants us to focus on, reflect on, and kind of dwell on the idea of how much effort it took to get drinkable water to 77,000 men and their horses every single day. He says that is not just a Herculean effort on the part of the grunts, right, the people who are doing the hauling, but it is an organizational, a logistical effort on the part of Grant and his logistical subcommanders, right, the quartermasters and their subcommanders, people who are working in supplying this army. A second scholar who thinks about the trials and tribulations of feeding this army is James Arnold, historian James Arnold. He argues this. He argues that Grant's army is actually aided in an unintended way by the Confederate agricultural policies that they institute in 1862 and 1863. So the Confederate legislature is attempting to get cotton planters to shift their growing from cotton into edible crops, right? Corn, basically. And over the course of 1862, 1863, they're providing some incentives and some penalties for cotton planters to do so. The early part of 1862 is marked by a Confederate law to, quote, encourage the burning of cotton, tobacco, and other crops that would be threatened by the Union, crops that could be seized by the Union and used for Union purposes or Union profit, but also crops that would be perhaps burned by the Union. And so the shift into edible crops out of cash crops, Arnold says, is one of those things that begins to aid Grant's army. In Louisiana, the sugar planters had not made this shift by March, April 1863, but Mississippi cotton planters had to some extent. And so it's those winter crops, the winter corn crop, that the Mississippi cotton planters had embarked on, and other spring vegetables that are in the fields. It's that food that Grant's army is keeping alive on after it crosses the Mississippi River. Two other things about the Vicksburg campaign once the siege begins. If you take a badly drawn human figure and you put that human figure behind a wall, right, a parapet, this is a Confederate soldier in Vicksburg being besieged by the Union, hiding behind a wall, essentially. There are difficulties for those Vicksburg defenders, and they have to do with the construction of earthworks, right? So ideally you have some kind of structure between you and your enemy, and in the months leading up to the siege of Vicksburg, the Confederates have been building earthworks. You get a massive amount of soil, of dirt, and you build it up to build something that can protect you. One of the problems is that the local soil of Vicksburg is like Mississippi River silt. It's a bad soil for constructing a wall. It's loose enough that it is not going to stop artillery shells in the way that, say, the sticky red clay of Virginia would. And so as they're building these earthen walls out of Mississippi River mud, the solution is to line those walls with cotton bales, right, on the inside. So you take an outer layer of soil, a middle layer of cotton, and then an interior layer of wood. This produces a new problem. The problem is that if an artillery shell is fired successfully into that earthen wall and penetrates the cotton, those cotton bales are going to ignite or at least smolder and release all kinds of smoke that will be suffocating for the Confederates, but also then perhaps reduce visibility for the Confederate defenders. And so the solution to that problem is to keep everything wet. There are bucket brigades to try to keep the cotton wet inside the earthen walls so that if the artillery shells do ignite inside the walls, the cotton will remain, the cotton won't take light. The problem is that cotton is pretty resistant to water. And so the water logistical needs of the Confederate Army, both in terms of keeping itself alive, but also in dealing with this problem of the earthen walls, is, again, a round-the-clock problem of logistics. And then a final problem for the Confederate defenders at Vicksburg is this. If you imagine that this right here is your view of Vicksburg defenses from the Union point of view. So you are in the foreground. This is you with your weapon looking forward across a grassy stretch. Up on the hill is a wall that is the Vicksburg defenses, the blue sky behind it. The problem for the defenders behind the wall in Vicksburg is that they are on high ground behind a wall. ideally this is the way to go, right? We've seen that the defense has the advantage in situations like this, but not necessarily in a siege situation. So that as anytime a Confederate defender sticks their head above that wall, the Union sharpshooter or the Union common soldier with a rifled weapon, who might get lucky, has a target, briefly perhaps, but a target at which to shoot. That Confederate figure coming above the wall is often silhouetted against a clear sky. And so they make a target that is ideal for the Union besiegers. This leads to a situation in which the Confederates are losing over 3,000 men during the siege. So this siege from late May to early July is a grueling logistical battle of attrition, but it's also a battle in which the Confederates are losing men. And most of those injuries are head wounds or upper body wounds. And you can understand why in this situation of Union sharpshooters watching the walls of Vicksburg and taking advantage of what they see. The end of the siege of Vicksburg comes when Pemberton, the Confederate commander, who has been dealing with troops who are on half rations and then double half rations for a while, who's been dealing with both the political horrors of giving up Vicksburg, but also the logistical horrors of keeping it. Pemberton circulates a letter to 4 division commanders under him, asking him if a breakout is possible. Are we able to get out of this city and at least keep the army alive or keep the garrison alive, even if the city is taken? Those division commanders defer. They don't want to make the call, so they defer to their sub-commanders, the brigade commanders. Of the 16 brigade commanders within the Confederate force, only 2 of them thought it was possible. And so Pemberton is going to ask for terms of surrender. He eventually explains to Joe Johnston, right, Confederate Commander Joe Johnston, quote, "It was impossible to withdraw the army from this position with such morale and material to be of further service to the Confederacy." Think about that statement, right? Take a moment to think about that statement. We could not have gotten out of Vicksburg in a state of mind, a state of morale, and in a physical state that would have been any use to the Confederates at all. And so our best option was surrender. When he asks Grant for terms, the terms he asks for and the terms he gets are that common soldiers within the ranks take nothing but their clothing, officers get clothing, a sidearm, and a horse, and that the army itself, as it leaves Vicksburg, gets to take 30 wagons worth of food that would be consumed on the journey away from Vicksburg. Grant accepts the terms, and he paroles Pemberton's army. Paroling the army means you have to register. Your name is going to be written in a roll in the parole list, and you, individual who has now been paroled, are not to serve again in the Confederate military. If you're ever caught in the service of the Confederate military, you will be executed, right? So the parole terms are, you're done, you're out of the war now. If you're brought back into the war against your will or by choice and you're caught, you will be executed. The Confederate Army leaves Vicksburg, and within 3 days, 10,000 of its forces have kind of melted away into the fields and woods surrounding its route out of Vicksburg. And one Confederate private notes in a letter, "General Grant could not have employed a more effective method of disbanding and disorganizing an army than the course he pursued. It was as effective as if a scourge had swept them from the path." This is all happening, again, within hours of the end of Gettysburg. And so here we are, early July 1863, and the Confederates have suffered from 2 major setbacks almost at the same time in the summer of 1863.